One of the ways to master the Steinitz variation of the French defense is by understanding this position. It's evident that black bishop is a bad piece, and with all pawns occupying light squares, the dark squares are weak. There is an open file, but black should not expect too much from it because all the squares in white's half are well defended. The key c2 square is controlled by the beautifully centralized knight. White's king has the opportunity to advance into the center, closer to d4. In certain scenarios, the king can use dark squares to advance on the queenside, possibly even reaching b6. This strategic setup is precisely what Steinitz envisioned when employing the French defense as white, and it's something black should strive to prevent. Now, let's see how black really ends up in such a terrible situation. Well, I think the best way to dive into it is by examining one of the main model games for anyone studying the Steinitz variation of the French. It features Steinitz himself playing as white against Alexander Selman. Our first focus in the game will be after knight c3, knight f6, e5, and knight d7. Black is obviously ready to advance c5. Now, compared to the advanced variation, the c3 knight in this position poses a problem by blocking the c2 pawn. To maintain their pawn chain, white must awkwardly maneuver their knight once more, making a series of jumps that seem to obstruct their own pieces. And from that perspective, playing knight c3 may seem illogical. However, Steinitz had a different plan in mind. His idea relies on the f-pawn to fulfill the role of the d-pawn in defending the other central pawn on e5. So black continues with c5, and here it is. White even traced the d4 pawn right away. After bishop takes c5 and knight f3, black responds with a6, intending to advance b5. And I know you'd want to know why this is important for black, but I'm planning to explain it later, not to complicate things here. Now, white makes an important move for this system, bishop d3. It's beautiful and dangerous at the same time. For example, if black castles, we'd have a Greek gift on h7, with knight g5, followed by queen h5 and queen h7 mate. There are ways to fight against this, but most often we can see black removing the d3 bishop before castling. Queen e2 move is common in this variation. One reason is to play bishop e3, exchange the bishops and regain the right to castle. Another reason is to free up squares for the king to castle queenside. And we can see that black uses this momentum to play knight b4, trapping the bishop on d3. Black may feel a sense of achievement in such situations in the French. However, in the Steinitz variation, that's not the case. White continued with bishop d2, then b5 and knight e1. If black allows bishop takes b4, it would be terrible, as the d3 bishop stays on the board. Thus, black opts to take, which allows c takes d3. Now, this change in pawn formation is truly one of the key moments in the Steinitz French. Keeping in mind that endgame we saw at the beginning, with a knight on d4 versus terrible bishop on b7, it becomes clear that from this moment onwards, white is comfortable trading possibly everything that doesn't include the bishop on c8. All endgames of that kind are better or winning for white. Black opted for queen b6. Then a nice move, b4. It forces the bishop away from this diagonal, making the d4 square less protected. White wants to play bishop e3 to secure knight e4 next. However, this cannot be done yet because the b4 pawn falls. Therefore, Steinitz plays a3. Here, black played another dubious move, f5. Which gains space but horribly weakens the e6 pawn. Instead of f5, I would suggest a move like d4. Despite the risk of losing the pawn, black needs to activate their light square bishop. Additionally, playing d4 would disrupt white's plan to solidify their knight on the d4 square. Once the pawn on d5 is gone, the d file becomes semi-open, perfect for black rooks. But we had f5, and then rook c1, bishop e7, and bishop e3. Queen goes back to d8, and then knight d4. Now with e6 under threat, black played knight f8 to defend it, white castled, and, out of desperation, another weak move, h5. It's clear that white dominates the board. And here we have a very nice maneuver by white that I'd like you to try to find. Pause the video and take some time to think. Often when you find a badly placed piece in your camp, that's a good sign that you should do something about that piece. In this situation, white has a plan to reposition the poorly placed knight to reach one of the two outposts on c5 or a5. It's a long journey, but feasible since there are no immediate threats and the position is relatively closed. Black played rook c8 to patch the hole on c5, which left only the a5 square for the white knight. Then there is an opportunity to take control of the open file by trading the first pair of rooks. After that, the other rook is brought to c1 with a tempo. And finally, the c-file gets secured with queen c2. Now there is a threat of reaching the 7th rank, so black needs to defend it with the move bishop d8. And then white opted for a move that is not easy to play because it offers a trade to a worse piece. This kind of moves should be played only when you are sure there is something concrete to follow. In this case, if black takes the knight, for sure they would lose the a6 pawn, and probably the b5 as well. Additionally, the rook can infiltrate on either c6 or c8. Selman decided not to trade, and Steinitz took on d8, followed by queen c7, of course. Now, if black takes, the rook recaptures, and if king e7, there is a beautiful move, bishop f2. It goes to h4, and black is good to resign. In the game, we had queen b8, and we can see white opting for the same plan, bishop f2. For the moment, black stops the deadly maneuver playing queen b6. But it doesn't prevent white from occupying another weak square, starting with knight f3 with the idea to play knight g5. Black gave up here and took on c7, followed by king e8 to unpin the knight. But knight g5 hits the pawn again, and in case of king e7, there is bishop c5, which is game over. So black played knight f8. But after bishop c5, threatening rook e7 mate, the knight went back to d7, leaving e6 undefended. Steinitz, however, ignored the pawn and played bishop d6, I would say even a better move, leaving black with practically no good moves. And Selman resigned. So, what did we see? Instead of simply advancing the d3 pawn, white used the d4 square as an outpost to cement their knight in the center. This is one of the main resources for white under this pawn structure. At the same time, black can't get rid of their bad bishop. Additionally, white also has great control over the dark squares. Let me recommend you what I do as black. And I think you'll be surprised to see that a FIDE master does not go deep into the theory when studying an opening. I'd first go back to this moment in the game and recommend delaying capturing back on c5. For instance, in case of an early bishop d3, there is knight takes c5, and this critical light square bishop is already under pressure. If white continues with knight f3, we can take, and if c takes d3, it is not the same as before, because without our d7 knight, we have greater potential with a d pawn. Say if white wants to bring their knight to d4, they'd need bishop e3 first, but then there is this fork. And in this position, we can even try to provoke d4 playing bishop c5. In any case, black is okay. An improved approach for white involves delayed capture on c5 and opting for the straightforward knight f3. For black, playing knight c6 is the most natural here. On the other side, white now needs to be careful and strictly develop with bishop e3 to defend d4. Otherwise, for instance, playing something like bishop e2 may already be losing. Pause the video and try to find a combination for black to win a pawn. It starts with the move c takes d4, followed by knight d takes e5. Then there is queen h4 check, and capturing the d4 knight at the end. To be honest, I didn't know about this trick till recently. Now we know why white opts for bishop e3, and we are reaching the moment to choose our strategy for black. The one you are going to see is the simplest and doesn't require anything to remember but a plan. It starts with the move a6, followed by b5. First of all, these pawns look menacing, and if white intended to castle long, they would undoubtedly be intimidated by the pawns. According to Stockfish, after c4, black is better by 3 points. Now, according to the opening theory, the best for white is to take on c5, and we recapture with the bishop. White has many options, but usually takes again, black recaptures, and then queen f2 is played. The idea is to cover the a7 g1 diagonal since black queen is coming to b6. And then they play this Steinitz move bishop d3. White is proposing the well-known endgame, which we have just studied and determined that black should avoid. And this is the moment to pause and consider the best plan aligning with the main strategic goals for black in the French defense overall. And one of the main goals of black in the French defense is to get rid of the bad bishop. Now, this is going to happen in a couple of moves, and the first one is b4. The knight goes to e2 and then we push a5, after which the move bishop a6 is available. And that's actually the key to understanding the Steinitz variation of the French. Once black trades their worst piece for the best piece of white, the game is even. Typically, white follows up with king h1, as black cannot capture on d3 twice due to the pin. Meanwhile, we can play knight e7 to counter white's common pawn break f5. It's worth noting an additional aspect in these positions. If white hastily captures on a6, they may encounter a problem on e4, where black can establish an outpost. According to the engine, black has an advantage in that case, and that's why you can see white normally waiting on d3 for black to capture first. Now that you grasped a fundamental concept for black, you can build upon it. And if you are an intermediate level player, you may even stop here. You already know more than enough. However, if you are curious about alternative scenarios, such as if white deviates from the main line and continues with the moves like bishop e2, we can explore how to play this middle game for black. As in many other cases, the first move is queen b6. And after knight e1, which is the main move, we employ the same plan, b4 and a5. I'd also like to add why it is good to take on d4, here, but also in many other situations. Before anything else, it complicates white's ability to advance f5 due to the weakened e5 pawn. Say white captures on c6, the queen recaptures, white takes again, we recapture with our knight, again aiming for the e4 square. Meanwhile, bishop a6 remains ready to be played, and black is doing well. Finally, the last resource for white to counter our plan of exchanging the light square bishops is simply to play a3. It doesn't completely stop our plan, but it does make it somewhat awkward for both sides. First, we proceed with queen b6 as usual. Then, even though it's not the main move, let's explore what happens if white persists in playing conventional chess on the king's side, assuming that their queen side is now secured. I think it is bishop e2 that they may play. We can continue with rook b8, a5 and b4 if we want, but I'd like to introduce somewhat more intriguing, a rarely seen resource for black in the French. We take on d4 to weaken white's e5 pawn, and then develop our bishop to c5. Let's say white brings their rook to d1, and here is the moment where black can employ the unusual strategy. Take a moment to pause and think about it. I'll just emphasize that this idea works best when the e5 pawn is not heavily defended. In such cases, the best solution may be to advance g5. And I don't know if you are surprised, but the engine sees 3 zeros here. But the objective assessment is less important. What matters is understanding the concept rather than memorizing exact lines. So add this g5 idea to your list, where the top priority remains advancing the queenside pawns and exchanging the light square bishop on a6.